In a gated community in Oakwood Estates, a black father calmly waiting in the guest parking lot was about to run afoul of the HOA president's watchful eye. What started as a routine Sunday pickup spiraled when Karen Whitfield called the police on him for suspicious behavior. Marcus Johnson wasn't your typical divorced dad making a weekend pickup. For 15 years, he had dealt with systemic injustice as a civil rights attorney, known for winning landmark racial profiling cases and dismantling discriminatory policies from the inside out. When Karen dialed 911 and reported Marcus as an unauthorized individual, she had no idea she was messing with a man who could and would turn that moment into a national reckoning. Marcus responded not with outrage, but with surgical legal precision, launching a civil rights lawsuit and a public education campaign that would set off a firestorm of media coverage, community backlash, and boardroom betrayals. What began as a petty power trip masked as neighborhood safety would become a dramatic public downfall that exposed Oakwood's hidden biases to the world. The manicured cul-de-sacs of Oakwood Estates would never forget the day Karen Whitfield met the one man who refused to stay silent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Johnson checked his watch as he pulled up to the ornate entrance of Oakwood Estates. 2:15, right on time. Through the wrought iron gates he could see uniform rows of pristine Tudor and colonial homes, each seemingly competing with the next for the most immaculate landscaping. The neighborhood Catherine had chosen after their divorce was exactly what she'd always wanted: exclusive, prestigious, and meticulously maintained. He texted Catherine, "Outside the gate. Kids ready?" Her response came quickly, running Tinman behind. "Sorry. Gate code is 4829 if you want to park in guest area." Marcus sighed, punching in the code. The heavy gates swung open with barely a whisper. Even the hinges in Oakwood were perfectly maintained. He navigated his BMW sedan through the entrance and into the visitor parking area, sliding into a spot near a small pavilion with a manicured garden. The April sun warmed his face as he stepped out, stretching his back after the 40-minute drive from downtown. After sitting at his desk all week preparing for a major discrimination case, his body craved movement. Rather than wait in the car, he decided to take a short walk around the guest parking area. Across the street, Karen Whitfield paused while arranging peonies on her front porch. Through the slats of her white railing, she noticed the unfamiliar man pacing near the pavilion. He was tall, well-dressed in dark jeans and a button-down shirt, but something about his presence made her shoulders tense. In her 15 years, at Oakwood she'd familiarized herself with nearly everyone who belonged, whether residents or regular visitors, and she'd never seen this man before. Karen's fingers tightened around her garden shears. The HOA had just discussed security concerns at last week's meeting, with Richard Powell, a retired police officer, warning about recent break-ins in neighboring communities. As the newly elected HOA president, she took neighborhood safety personally. When the man walked toward the edge of the garden and took a phone from his pocket, her suspicion crystallized into certainty. Without hesitation, she retreated into her house, closed the door, and dialed 911. "There's an unauthorized individual lurking in Oakwood Estates," she reported, her voice hushed but insistent. "He's been pacing around for over 10 minutes, looking at houses, and he definitely doesn't live here. I'm concerned he might be casing homes." "Can you describe this person, ma'am?" the dispatcher asked. Karen chose her words carefully. "Tall, African-American man, maybe in his 40s. He's walking around the guest parking area near the front gate. He just seems out of place here." Meanwhile, Marcus had returned to his car, scrolling through work emails as he waited. A muted flash of blue and red reflected off his rearview mirror 15 minutes later. He looked up to see a police cruiser pulling into the guest lot. 2 officers emerged, one older and white, the other younger and Hispanic, both scanning the area until their eyes landed on him. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever he saw police in his vicinity, a conditioned response from a lifetime of similar encounters. As they approached, he assessed them with the trained eye of someone who'd represented dozens of clients in police misconduct cases. The younger officer seemed hesitant, while the older one moved with practiced authority. "Good afternoon, sir," the older officer said. "Mind if we ask what you're doing here today?" Marcus kept his expression neutral, his voice measured. "I'm picking up my children from their mother's house. She lives in the community and is running a bit late. We received a call about someone suspicious in the area," the older officer continued. "Can I see some identification, please?" Marcus noted they hadn't asked for the name of his ex-wife or her address first, just immediately requested ID. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket and retrieved his wallet. "I'm going to take out my driver's license," he narrated calmly. The younger officer, whose nameplate read Ramirez, shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as a few residents began to emerge from nearby homes. An older couple paused their dog walk to observe. A man watering his lawn turned off the hose. "Before I provide my ID," Marcus said, reaching into his other pocket, "I'm going to take out my phone and record this interaction." His movements were deliberate as he opened his camera app and began recording. "Now could you please explain why you're questioning me while I wait to pick up my children?" The older officer's posture stiffened. "Sir, we're responding to a call about a suspicious person." "And what exactly makes me suspicious?" Marcus asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of professional precision. Officer Ramirez looked increasingly uncomfortable as more neighbors gathered at a distance. "Sir, we're just doing our job following up on a call." "I understand you're following up," Marcus replied. "I'm simply asking what specific behaviors were reported as suspicious." Before either officer could respond, Marcus heard a familiar voice calling his name. He turned to see Catherine hurrying toward them, her face flushed with embarrassment. Behind her trailed Zoe and Tyler, their weekend bags clutched in their hands. 14-year-old Zoe's face transformed from confusion to understanding in an instant. Her shoulders squared as she quickened her pace, positioning herself slightly in front of her younger brother. Tyler, at 10, looked between the police officers and his father with wide, frightened eyes. "Marcus, I'm so sorry we're late," Catherine said breathlessly, her gaze darting between her ex-husband and the officers. What's happening here?" "Apparently someone called the police because I looked suspicious waiting for my children," Marcus explained, the camera still recording. From across the street, Karen Whitfield had emerged from her house, arms crossed as she observed the scene unfolding. Several other neighbors had joined the growing audience, some whispering to each other, others watching in uncomfortable silence. "Mrs. Johnson?" the older officer asked Catherine. "Ms. Pearson now," Catherine corrected, reverting to her maiden name. "But yes, this is my ex-husband, Marcus Johnson. He's here to pick up our children after their weekend visit." Officer Ramirez nodded, visibly relieved. "Thank you, ma'am. Sorry for the confusion." He turned to his partner with a look that clearly suggested they should leave. "Dad, are you okay?" Zoe asked, her young voice steady despite the tension. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Marcus answered, his eyes still on the officers. "Just a misunderstanding." The older officer cleared his throat. "Well, everything seems to be in order here. Sorry to bother you, sir." Marcus nodded, still recording. "Officer Ramirez," he said, reading the younger officer's nameplate again. "May I have your badge number and your partner's name and badge number as well, please?" The request hung in the air for a moment before Officer Ramirez provided the information, his partner following suit with visible reluctance. The crowd of neighbors had grown to nearly a dozen, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort to something darker that Marcus recognized all too well. As the officers retreated to their cruiser, Catherine leaned closer to Marcus. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. I don't know who would have called." But Marcus did. His gaze found Karen Whitfield, still watching from her manicured lawn. Their eyes met briefly before she turned away, disappearing into her perfect house. "Kids, say goodbye to your mom," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. "Time to go." Zoe hugged Catherine quickly, her eyes never leaving her father. Tyler clung to his mother a moment longer, his small body tense with confusion. "I'll call," You tonight? Catherine promised, kissing the top of Tyler's head before reluctantly letting him go. Marcus helped the children into the car, hyper-aware of the watching neighbors. He maintained his composed demeanor, a skill honed through years of courtroom battles, but inside, a cold anger was crystallizing into resolve. As he drove away from Oakwood Estates, the gates closing behind them, the car remained unusually quiet. In the rearview mirror, Marcus could see Zoe's protective arm around her brother, her young face set in an expression no 14-year-old should have to wear. "Dad?" Tyler finally asked, his voice small. "Why did those police officers think you did something wrong?" Marcus met his son's eyes in the mirror, considering his answer carefully. Next to Tyler, Zoe watched with the weary understanding of a black child who'd already learned too many hard lessons about the world. Sometimes people make judgments based on how someone looks, not who they really are, Marcus explained. But we're going to make sure something good comes from what happened today. As the perfect houses of Oakwood Estates receded in the distance, Marcus Johnson, father, ex-husband, and civil rights attorney, made a decision. This wouldn't be just another story to tell his children about navigating a world that too often viewed them with suspicion. This time he would transform humiliation into action and force a community hiding behind manicured perfection to face its ugliest truths. The silence in Marcus's downtown apartment lingered long after they arrived home. While Tyler retreated to the guest bedroom he used during visits, Zoe remained in the living room, her fingers tapping furiously on her phone. "Who are you texting?" Marcus asked, setting 2 mugs of hot chocolate on the coffee table. "Mom," Zoe replied without looking up. "She keeps asking if we're okay." Marcus sat beside his daughter, noticing the tension in her shoulders. "And are you? Okay, I mean." Zoe finally set her phone down. "I'm fine. It's not like it's the first time I've seen something like this happen." Her voice carried a weariness that broke Marcus's heart. But Tyler's really upset. He didn't understand what was happening. In the guest bedroom, the sound of quiet sniffling confirmed her assessment. Marcus squeezed Zoe's hand before rising and gently knocking on Tyler's door. "Hey, buddy," he said, finding his son curled up on the bed. "Think we could talk for a minute?" Tyler wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Those police thought you were a bad guy, didn't they? Because you're black." Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. Some people make wrong assumptions about others based on how they look. What happened today is called racial profiling. Like when the security guard followed us in the electronics store last month. Yes, exactly like that. Marcus felt the familiar ache of a parent watching their child confront the world's ugliness too soon. But remember what I always tell you. Their assumptions about us don't define who we are, Tyler recited, a lesson learned far earlier than any child should need to. That's right. And sometimes when people treat us unfairly, we have to stand up not just for ourselves but for others who might face the same treatment. Later that night, after both children had fallen asleep, Marcus reviewed the video on his phone. The footage was clear, capturing every word, every uncomfortable shift of Officer Ramirez's stance, every neighbor gathering to watch. Most damning of all, it showed Karen Whitfield in the background, arms crossed, watching the scene she had orchestrated. He forwarded the video to his work email before finally trying to sleep himself. Across town in Oakwood Estates, Karen Whitfield couldn't sleep. The confrontation hadn't gone as expected. The man, Marcus she now knew, had been too composed, too confident, and he'd been recording. The thought made her stomach tighten. When her phone rang at 7:30 a.m., she answered immediately. "I've been thinking about this all night." "Richard," Powell's gravelly voice came through the line. "We need to get ahead of it. Emergency HOA meeting today if possible." By noon, Karen had arranged for the meeting to take place in her spacious living room. 8 board members sat on her carefully, arranged furniture with Richard positioned prominently in an armchair to her right. "I've asked Richard to start us off given his law enforcement background," Karen began once everyone had settled with coffee and the lemon bars she'd baked that morning. Richard cleared his throat. "What Karen did yesterday was exactly what we've been encouraging residents to do. If you see something suspicious, report it. Better safe than sorry. But was he actually doing anything suspicious? Asked Diane Chen, one of the newer board members. From what I heard, he was just waiting. For his children. Karen felt her face flush. He was pacing around the property for almost 30 minutes. And how was I supposed to know he was Catherine's ex-husband? She never introduced him to any of us. He did seem perfectly calm when the officers arrived, remarked James Turner, a board member who lived near the guest area. And he started, recording everything on his phone right away. Richard leaned forward. That's actually concerning. People who immediately start recording often have an agenda. They're looking to create a situation. Or they've learned from experience that they need evidence, Diane countered, earning a sharp look from Karen. The point is, Karen interjected, I acted in the best interest of our community. Our property values depend on security and exclusivity. That's why people move to Oakwood. Richard nodded firmly. Absolutely. And let's remember, all of this could have been avoided if Catherine had properly notified the HOA about regular visitors, as required in Section 8.3 of our bylaws. The meeting continued for another hour, with Richard skillfully redirecting any concerns toward procedural issues rather than Karen's judgment. By the end, most members seemed reassured, though Diane's skeptical expression lingered in Karen's mind as everyone departed. She was rinsing coffee cups when her phone rang again, Catherine Pearson's name flashing on the screen. Karen hesitated before answering. Karen, I think we need to talk about what happened yesterday, Catherine said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. I was actually going to call you, Karen replied smoothly. The board had concerns about your failure to register your ex-husband as a regular visitor. It's clearly outlined in the bylaws. A pause. Is that really what you want to discuss right now? Not the fact that you called the police on my children's father without even attempting to speak with him first? Catherine, I understand you're upset, but community safety is my responsibility as HOA president. I didn't know who he was. My children were traumatized, Karen. Tyler had nightmares last night. Karen's grip tightened on the phone. I'm sorry your children were upset, but perhaps this could be a learning opportunity about following community guidelines. If you'd properly registered Marcus as a visitor— Stop, Catherine interrupted. Just stop. I thought we were friends. Karen. The line went dead, leaving Karen staring at her phone, a mixture of indignation and unease washing over her. At Oakwood Preparatory Academy on Monday morning, Zoe Johnson sat alone in the cafeteria, uncomfortably aware of the whispers and glances from her classmates. Being one of only 3 black students in her grade had always created a sense of isolation, but today felt different. Is it true your dad almost got arrested at Oakwood this weekend? Zoe looked up to see Madeline Wright, daughter of another HOA board member, standing by her table with 2 other girls. No, Zoe replied firmly. The police questioned him because someone called them for no reason while he was waiting to pick us up. Madeline exchanged glances with her friends. My mom said he was acting suspicious. He was checking his emails, Zoe said, feeling heat rise in her face. Since when is that suspicious? My dad says people need to respect police authority, one of Madeline's friends added. If you just cooperate, nothing bad happens. Zoe gathered her belongings, her mother's voice in her head reminding her to stay calm. Your dad is wrong, she said simply, walking away as the girls exchanged shocked looks behind her. In the library during study hall, Zoe found herself searching racial profiling statistics on her tablet, clicking through article after article with a growing sense of purpose. At Stallworth and Johnson Law, Marcus sat with his 3 partners in the conference room, the video from Sunday playing on the large screen. This is textbook racial profiling, said Amelia Stallworth, the firm's founding partner, and with the responding officers' badge numbers and the clear video evidence, we could build a case against the police department. Marcus shook his head. The officers were responding to a call. They were awkward and presumptive, but relatively professional. He paused the video on a frame showing Karen watching from across the street. She's the one who needs to be held accountable, along with the HOA that empowers her. Jordan Kim, another partner, leaned forward. A civil rights case against a homeowners association would be challenging but not unprecedented. We'd need to establish a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Catherine tells me there are exactly 2 black families currently living in Oakwood Estates, both reporting extra scrutiny from the HOA, Marcus said. And there's something else. He pulled out a folder containing HOA documents. Catherine had sent him that morning. Their visitor registration policy was implemented just 8 months ago, after the first black family moved in. Coincidence? Even with all this, it's still not an easy case, Amelia cautioned. HOAs have considerable legal protection, and proving racial animus can be difficult without explicit statements. I'm not just thinking about winning a lawsuit, Marcus replied, his voice quiet but determined. I'm thinking about my children having to visit their mother in a community where this kind of behavior is normalized, about other families experiencing the same thing without the legal knowledge to fight back. He stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city. This isn't just another case. It's about forcing accountability in spaces that are designed to avoid it. Later that evening, while the children were doing homework, Marcus received a text from Catherine. Karen just called, said the HOA is concerned I didn't register you as a visitor. No mention of what she did. I'm so sorry, Marcus. As Marcus stared at the message, Tyler appeared in the doorway of his home office, hair tousled from sleep despite the early hour. Dad, he said, his voice small. I had a bad dream about the police again. Marcus opened his arms and Tyler climbed into his lap like he used to when he was younger. Do we have to go back to Mom's house this weekend? He asked against Marcus's shoulder. We're going to figure this out, Marcus promised, making his decision final. I won't let this happen again, to us or anyone else. 3 days later, Karen was reviewing paint color submissions for the spring inspection when her phone rang. It was Richard, his voice uncharacteristically tense. Karen, we have a situation. Jeremy in the management office just got a notice. Marcus Johnson is filing a discrimination lawsuit against you personally and the HOA collectively. Karen's hand froze on her paint samples. What? That's ridiculous. On what grounds? Racial discrimination, creating a hostile environment, intentional infliction of emotional distress. It's a whole list. And Karen... Richard lowered his voice. He's apparently also launching some kind of community education initiative about housing discrimination. He's partnering with that new black professor who moved in on Maple Street. The paint chips scattered across the counter as Karen gripped the edge of the granite. This can't be happening, she whispered. But even as she said it, she remembered Marcus's steady hand holding his phone, recording everything, the composed, strategic look in his eyes as he'd asked for the officers' badge numbers. Outside her window, the perfect uniformity of Oakwood Estates suddenly seemed fragile, a facade that could crack under pressure. What had begun as a simple call to police was transforming into something much larger, something that threatened the careful control she'd built over her life and community since her own divorce. Karen, are you still there? Richard's voice pulled her back. Yes, she said, straightening her shoulders. Call the HOA attorney. We're not going to let some outsider destroy everything we've built here. As she hung up, Karen didn't notice. Catherine Pearson watching from across the street, her expression troubled as she observed the HOA president through the window. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. It's done. I'm sorry it came to this, but it's the right thing to do. The kids okay? Catherine looked back at Karen's house, then down at her phone, feeling the ground shifting beneath the life she'd tried to create in Oakwood Estates. They're okay, she replied, and don't apologize. I'm beginning to think I'm the one who made the mistake, thinking this was a good place to raise our children. Across town, Marcus read Catherine's message with surprise, then turned back to his computer, where the formal complaint against Karen Whitfield and the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association waited to be filed. Beside it sat another document, a proposal for community conversations, Understanding Housing Discrimination and Racial Bias, with Dr. Amara Washington, the sociology professor who had recently moved to Oakwood despite her own reservations. As he submitted both documents, Marcus thought of Tyler's nightmares and Zoe's too adult understanding of a world that judged her before knowing her. What had started as a Sunday afternoon pickup had transformed into something far more significant, a challenge not just to one woman's prejudice but to an entire community's willful blindness. The battle lines were being drawn, and Oakwood Estates would never be the same. And tonight's top story, a discrimination lawsuit filed against an upscale suburban homeowners association, has ignited controversy after video of the incident went viral. The Channel 8 news anchor's voice filled Karen Whitfield's living room as she sat rigidly on her sofa, remote control clutched in her hand. On screen, the footage Marcus had recorded played for what seemed like the 100th time, now with slick graphics and a dramatic news ticker. Racial profiling in gated community? The incident occurred when HOA President Karen Whitfield called police on Marcus Johnson, a prominent civil rights attorney who was waiting to pick up his children from his ex-wife's home. Johnson recorded the encounter, which many viewers have characterized as an example of racial profiling. The screen cut to Marcus, standing outside his law office, composed and articulate in a well-tailored suit. "This isn't just about one incident, or one person," he was saying. "It's about dismantling systems that normalize discrimination and exclusion. When communities use terms like safety and property values as proxies for keeping certain people out, we need to confront that directly." Karen jabbed the power button, plunging the room into silence. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop since the story broke that morning. Half the messages were from Richard and other allies expressing support. The other half were from concerned board members questioning her judgment. 3 were from the HOA's insurance company. Her doorbell rang, startling her. Through the peephole, she saw Richard Powell standing on her porch, his expression grim. "I've seen it," she said as she opened the door. Richard stepped inside, his retired police officer's posture even more rigid than usual. "The board's attorney wants an emergency meeting tonight. The insurance company is involved now." "They can't possibly think I did anything wrong," Karen said, leading him to the kitchen where a bottle of Chardonnay already sat open. "I was protecting the neighborhood like we always agreed we should." "Of course you were," Richard affirmed, accepting a glass. "That's why I've already set up a support committee for you. 10 residents so far who are willing to publicly back your actions." Karen felt a flicker of relief. "Who?" "The usual crowd. Thompson, the Walkers, both Morrisons, the Bennetts." He took a deep swallow of wine. "But I'll be honest, Karen. Some people are keeping their distance. That new professor on Maple Street is already holding little discussions with neighbors." "Amara Washington," Karen said, the name sour on her tongue. "She moved in 2 months ago and hasn't even attended a single HOA meeting. Now she's part of Johnson's lawsuit and his so-called community initiative." "She's dangerous precisely because she seems so reasonable," Richard warned. "I heard she invited Catherine for coffee yesterday." Karen's hand tightened around her. "Wine glass. Catherine needs to decide whose side she's on." Across Oakwood Estates, in a sunlit corner of the Morning Brew Cafe, Catherine Pearson sat across from Amara Washington, a woman she'd only nodded to at the mailboxes before today. "I appreciate you meeting with me," Amara said. At 43, she carried herself with the confident poise of someone comfortable in academic settings, but her warm smile softened her scholarly demeanor. "I imagine you're in a difficult position right now." Catherine stared into her latte. "That's an understatement. Half the mothers at school pickup yesterday wouldn't make eye contact with me. The other half wanted gossip about Marcus." "And the children?" Catherine's facade cracked slightly. "Tyler's teacher called yesterday. He's withdrawn in class, his grades are slipping. And Zoe?" She shook her head. "Zoe's becoming increasingly confrontational. She got into an argument with one of Karen's daughter's friends yesterday." Amara nodded thoughtfully. "Children are perceptive. They're watching how the adults around them respond to injustice." "I feel caught in the middle," Catherine admitted. "Marcus is right to file the lawsuit. What Karen did was wrong, and her refusal to acknowledge it is worse. But this is also my community now, my neighbors." "Communities aren't just about geography," Amara observed. "They're about shared values. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I'm partnering with Marcus on a series of educational forums about housing discrimination and racial bias. The first session is next week at the community college. It might help you process what you're feeling. Catherine looked up, meeting Amara's steady gaze. Will you be discussing Oakwood specifically? Not by name, Amara assured her. This isn't about public shaming, it's about creating space for honest conversation about biases we all carry. As they finished their coffee, Catherine noticed Karen's close friend Bethany Walsh watching them. From across the cafe, phone in hand as if documenting their meeting. The battle lines were being drawn and Catherine was being forced to choose a side. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear for Oakwood's annual spring picnic. The event, normally a carefree celebration of the season, carried a distinctly different energy this year. The usual bouncy castle and face-painting stations were set up on the community green, but parents clustered in tight, whispering groups, conversations halting whenever someone from an opposing faction approached. The picnic tables had organically segregated. Karen, Richard, and their supporters claimed the area near the grills, while those sympathetic to Marcus or simply uncomfortable with Karen's actions gathered near the playground. A third group, those desperately trying to remain neutral, huddled awkwardly by the dessert table, their strained smiles and overenthusiastic discussion of the weather fooling no one. Catherine arrived with Zoe and Tyler, immediately feeling the weight of stares. Tyler pressed closer to her side while Zoe surveyed the divided landscape with a wisdom beyond her 14 years. We don't have to stay long, Catherine whispered to them. It's fine, Mom, Zoe replied, squaring her shoulders. I'm not afraid of them. From across the green, Karen watched Catherine's arrival, noting how Diane Chen and two other wavering board members immediately approached her. The betrayal stung, especially when she saw Catherine introduce Zoe to Amara Washington, who stood listening intently to something the teenager was saying. They're trying to turn this into something it's not, Richard muttered beside her, following her gaze. We need to control the narrative. Karen nodded absently, startled when she caught Officer Ramirez, off-duty and in civilian clothes, standing at the edge of the gathering. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away, accepting a plate of food from his wife. Why is he here? Karen whispered to Richard. He doesn't even live in Oakwood. His sister-in-law does, Richard replied. And from what I hear, he's been quiet at the station about the incident, not explicitly backing us. Karen felt another crack in her carefully constructed shield. The officer's discomfort during the confrontation had been obvious, but she'd counted on professional solidarity to keep him aligned with her version of events. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the playground. Zoe Johnson stood, face to face with Madeline Wright, their voices carrying across the suddenly quiet picnic area. You don't know what you're talking about, Zoe was saying, her voice controlled but intense. Your parents are just repeating talking points instead of facing the actual issue. My mom says your dad is just using this for publicity for his law firm, Madeline shot back, and that he's trying to extort money from the HOA. Your mom called the police on my dad for being black in her neighborhood, Zoe responded, loud enough for everyone to hear. And instead of apologizing, she's doubling down and making excuses. Across the green, adults froze mid-conversation. Catherine stepped forward, but Amara gently placed a hand on her arm. Let her speak her truth, Amara said softly. She needs this. Karen felt every eye turn to her, waiting for her response. The perfect, controlled community she'd presided over was fracturing before her eyes. For a moment, doubt crept in. Had she overreacted that day? But Richard was already moving toward the confrontation, his authoritative presence brooking no argument. Young lady, he addressed Zoe. That's a very serious accusation. No one called the police on your father for his race. They were called because of suspicious behavior in a private community. Checking emails is suspicious? Zoe challenged, undaunted by the former police officer's attempt at intimidation. Zoe, Catherine finally intervened, moving to her daughter's side. That's enough for now. Is it, though? Zoe asked, looking around at the uncomfortable adults. Because it seems like everyone wants to pretend this isn't exactly what it is. The spring picnic dissolved shortly after, families retreating to their perfect homes with their imperfect thoughts. The facade of community harmony shattered. In his downtown apartment that evening, Marcus reviewed the latest development in the lawsuit, a motion from the HOA's attorney to dismiss the case when his phone rang. "Mr. Johnson, this is Miguel Ramirez, the officer from—" He hesitated. "I remember, Officer Ramirez," Marcus replied, setting down his papers. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to talk to you about that day," Ramirez said, his voice lowered as if concerned about being overheard. "Off the record, I've been thinking about it a lot." "I'm listening." "The call we received, it specifically mentioned you as out of place in the neighborhood. I should have questioned that characterization more thoroughly before approaching you." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I saw your kids today at the neighborhood picnic. Your son wouldn't make eye contact with me, and your daughter looked at me like I was the enemy." Ramirez paused. "I became a police officer to protect people, not to make children afraid. Fear is a learned response, Officer Ramirez. My children have learned that even waiting for their father can be dangerous if you look like us." "I understand that better now," Ramirez admitted. "I can't officially support your lawsuit, but I wanted you to know I'm implementing new training protocols for my unit on community interactions and implicit bias." After hanging up, Marcus sat with the conversation for several minutes before texting Catherine. "How did the picnic go?" Her response came quickly, about as expected. "Zoe confronted one of Karen's allies' daughter. She's becoming quite the activist. And Tyler? Quiet. Didn't leave my side. We need to talk about summer arrangements. Not sure Oakwood is the right environment right now." Marcus weighed his response carefully. "I'd be happy to take them more this summer, but running from the problem won't solve it." Three dots appeared and disappeared several times before Catherine finally replied, "Maybe some problems aren't meant to be solved. Maybe we just protect our children from them." Marcus thought of Tyler's nightmares and Zoe's growing anger. Sometimes protection means confronting the problem, not avoiding it. That's what the education initiative is about. The Channel 8 news played softly in the background as a reminder notification appeared on his phone. Interview tomorrow, 10 a.m. His opportunity to shape the public narrative around the lawsuit and bring attention to the deeper issues at play. The following morning, Marcus stood outside his law office as the Channel 8 crew set up for the interview. Dressed in a navy suit that projected both authority and approachability, he reviewed talking points with his partner, Amelia. "Remember, this isn't just about Karen Whitfield or even the HOA," Amelia advised. "It's about the broader pattern of housing discrimination that continues through more subtle means today." Marcus nodded. "We need to be clear that this lawsuit isn't seeking revenge. It's seeking accountability and systemic change." As the interview began, Marcus spoke with the measured precision of an experienced attorney combined with the emotional authenticity of a father protecting his children. "What happened to me at Oakwood Estates happens daily to people of color across this country," he explained. "The difference is that I have the legal knowledge and resources to challenge it. Most people don't." The HOA president's attorney has stated that this was simply a security precaution in a private community, not a racial incident, the reporter countered. "When security is invoked selectively based on race, that's the definition of discrimination," Marcus replied. "The question we should all be asking is, who gets to feel secure in these spaces? Who is presumed to belong? And who is presumed to be an intruder?" As the cameras rolled, he outlined the educational initiative he and Amara were launching. "This isn't just about legal action. It's about creating spaces for honest conversation about the biases we all carry. The first Community Conversations Forum will be held next Thursday at the community college. Everyone is welcome, especially those who disagree with me." Miles away in Oakwood Estates, Karen watched the interview with growing dread. Marcus Johnson was articulate, reasonable, and compelling, nothing like the angry aggressor Richard had predicted. Worse, he came across as genuinely interested in community healing alongside accountability. Her phone chimed with a text from the HOA's attorney. We need to discuss settlement options. Video evidence and public opinion are not in our favor. For the first time since the incident, Karen felt the ground truly shifting beneath her carefully constructed life. Her position, her reputation, her community standing, all were at risk. The perfect life she'd rebuilt after her divorce was crumbling, and there was no clear path to restore it. Across town, Amara Washington ended a phone call with Marcus, satisfied with the interview's impact. From her window, she could see Catherine's house, where Zoe sat on the front steps working on something that looked like a school project. The teenager had approached her at the picnic, with surprisingly insightful questions about housing segregation policies and their modern legacy. Amara's research on community conflict resolution had always been academic. Now she was living within her own case study, watching theory transform into messy, painful reality. As a newcomer to Oakwood with professional expertise in exactly the issues at hand, she occupied a unique position, not personally involved in the incident, but professionally invested in the outcome. As she prepared notes for the upcoming forum, Amara considered the fractured community around her. Battle lines had been drawn, but the true challenge lay in creating space for people to step across those lines, to see beyond their defensive positions toward genuine understanding. The lawsuit would proceed through the legal system, but the real transformation of Oakwood Estates would happen in living rooms and coffee shops, at school events, and community forums. It would happen when enough people found the courage to question comfortable assumptions and confront uncomfortable truths. And as the sun set over the divided neighborhood, the first Community Conversations invitation appeared in every Oakwood resident's email inbox, forcing each to decide whether they would participate in the difficult work of change or cling to the comfortable illusion of the status quo. "I still think confronting housing discrimination sounds too accusatory," Marcus said, leaning against the whiteboard in Amara's home office. "We want people to come, not feel attacked before they even arrive." Amara considered the title they'd been debating for the past hour. The flyers and email announcements for their first community forum needed to go out tomorrow. "You're right. What about community conversations, building inclusive neighborhoods?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Better. It emphasizes construction rather than confrontation." While still addressing the real issues, Amara added, typing the new title into her laptop. "The community college auditorium is confirmed for Thursday at 7 p.m. They're even offering childcare in the adjacent classroom." "Good. That removes one barrier for parents," Marcus said, studying the outline they'd developed. "We need to balance the academic research with personal testimonies. People may challenge statistics, but it's harder to dismiss lived experiences. I've found 3 Oakwood residents willing to share stories of subtle discrimination they've experienced," Amara said, "and 2 former residents who were essentially pushed out by selective HOA enforcement." Marcus checked his watch. "I have to pick up Zoe and Tyler from school. They're staying with me this week while Catherine attends that real estate conference." He paused at the door. "Have you heard any pushback about the forum?" Amara's expression tightened. "Richard Powell has been making calls. Apparently he's telling people attending would be taking sides against the community. Some residents have withdrawn their participation." "Not surprising," Marcus replied. "But remember, we don't need everyone. We just need to start the conversation." In the Oakwood Estates Community Center, Karen stood before a hastily assembled group of 15 residents, including most of her reliable supporters. "This so-called educational forum is nothing but an attempt to gather ammunition for Johnson's lawsuit," she insisted. "Attending legitimizes his claims against our community." Richard Powell, stationed strategically at her right shoulder, nodded gravely. "Any statements made there could potentially be used in court. I strongly advise everyone to stay away." Bethany Walsh, who had been documenting Catherine's coffee with Amara weeks earlier, raised her hand. "What if people go just to see what they're saying about us to report back?" Karen hesitated. The question highlighted a dilemma she'd been wrestling with herself. Part of her desperately wanted to know exactly what Marcus and Amara were planning, but attending would undermine her boycott. I think that could be misinterpreted as support, she said carefully. Better to present a unified front by staying away entirely. After the meeting, Richard lingered, waiting until the last resident had left before speaking.
The HOA's attorney called me yesterday. He's concerned about the lawsuit's discovery process. Karen's shoulders stiffened. What specifically? They'll request all HOA communications regarding visitor policies, security measures, and enforcement.
Actions, including personal emails and texts between board members. The implications settled heavily between them. Karen thought of the numerous messages she'd exchanged with Richard about maintaining community standards and keeping undesirable elements out of Oakwood. There's something else, Richard continued, his voice lowered. The insurance company is pushing for mediation. They're worried about potential damages if this goes to trial. Mediation? Karen's voice rose sharply. That suggests we did something wrong. We didn't. Richard's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed concern. Karen, this isn't just about being right anymore. It's about limiting damage to the community and to you personally. Catherine stared at the email invitation to community conversations on her laptop screen, her finger hovering over the RSVP yes button. The conference call she'd scheduled as an excuse not to attend had been unexpectedly canceled, removing her last barrier. Her phone buzzed with a text from Bethany. Are you going to Johnson's propaganda session Thursday? Karen says it's just ammunition for his lawsuit. Catherine set the phone down without responding. In the 3 weeks since the spring picnic confrontation, she'd gradually withdrawn from her former social circle. The coldness from other mothers, the whispers that stopped when she approached, it had become unbearable. But actively attending Marcus and Amara's forum felt like a public declaration of allegiance she wasn't sure she was ready to make. From the family room came the sound of Zoe's voice, unexpectedly animated, as she explained something to Tyler. Catherine moved to the doorway, listening as her daughter pointed to a website about housing segregation. See, Tyler? These were called restrictive covenants. They were rules that said who could buy houses in certain neighborhoods. Lots of them specifically said no black families allowed. That was a long time ago, right? Tyler asked, his voice small. Those specific rules were outlawed, but Dr. Washington says the same patterns still exist. They're just more hidden now. That's what Dad's lawsuit is about. Catherine watched her children, Zoe confidently educating her brother, Tyler absorbing information that would shape his understanding of the world. In that moment, her decision crystallized. She returned to her laptop and clicked RSVP yes before she could reconsider. Thursday evening arrived with a persistent drizzle that seemed fitting for the mood in Oakwood Estates. At the community college auditorium, Marcus and Amara arranged chairs in a semicircle rather than the traditional rows, creating a space designed for conversation rather than lecture. Expecting a full house? Asked Jordan Kim, who had arrived early to help set up. We have 43 confirmed RSVPs, Amara replied, adjusting the refreshment table. But I suspect we'll have some unregistered attendees as well, people who didn't want their names on a public list. By 6:45, people began filtering in. First came those with no connection to Oakwood, community activists, college students, and a few local clergy members. Then Diane Chen arrived with 3 other HOA board members who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Karen's position. Marcus greeted each person personally, his genuine warmth creating an atmosphere that defied the tension surrounding the event. At 6:55, Catherine slipped in quietly, choosing a seat near the middle of the semicircle. Zoe followed confidently, behind her, but Tyler had opted to stay in the childcare room. Thank you for coming, Marcus said, approaching Catherine with restrained formality, aware of the watching eyes. The children insisted, Catherine replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. At precisely 7, with the auditorium about 2/3 full, Marcus noticed a figure entering discreetly through the side door. Officer Ramirez, dressed in civilian clothes, choosing a seat in the back corner. Their eyes met briefly, and Marcus gave a subtle nod of acknowledgement. 5 minutes later, as Amara was about to begin, the main doors opened again. A hush fell over the room as three unexpected attendees entered. Bethany Walsh, followed by two other women from Karen's inner circle. They sat rigidly together in the back row, expressions closed but watchful. "Welcome, everyone," Amara began, her academic confidence tempered by genuine warmth. "We've gathered tonight not to assign blame or to debate specific incidents, but to better understand the history and present reality of housing discrimination in our community." Over the next 30 minutes, she presented a concise overview of historical housing policies, redlining, restrictive covenants, blockbusting, and their continuing impact on modern neighborhood demographics. Marcus followed with concrete examples of how seemingly neutral HOA policies could have discriminatory effects when selectively enforced. "Now," Amara said, "we'd like to hear some personal experiences from community members. Mr. Farouk, would you begin?" Sanjay Farouk, a Oakwood resident of 5 years, stepped to the front. His normally jovial demeanor was replaced with uncharacteristic solemnity. "My family and I moved to Oakwood in 2019. Within our first month, we received 4 separate citations for violations of HOA rules we weren't even aware existed. The height of our mailbox, the color of our garden hose, the placement of our trash bins. Our white neighbors had identical violations but received no citations." A murmur ran through the audience as Sanjay continued, detailing the subtle but persistent scrutiny his Indian-American family had faced. In the back row, Bethany shifted uncomfortably, having served on the compliance committee that had issued those citations. 2 more testimonies followed. A black family who had ultimately left Oakwood after constantly being asked if they were visiting someone while walking in their own neighborhood, and an older Jewish couple who had been repeatedly reported for supposed noise violations during Shabbat dinners. The room grew increasingly still as each story built upon the last, creating a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Even Bethany and her companions had stopped taking notes, their expressions shifting from skepticism to uncomfortable recognition. "Before we open for questions," Marcus said, "I want to emphasize that tonight isn't about pointing fingers at individuals. It's about recognizing patterns that many of us participate in without conscious malice. The question is not, are we bad people? But rather, how can we build better, more inclusive communities?" Hands shot up across the auditorium. For the next 40 minutes, Marcus and Amara fielded questions ranging from thoughtful to defensive. The atmosphere occasionally grew heated, particularly when one of Karen's supporters attempted to dismiss the testimonies as isolated incidents. "With respect," responded Diane Chen, surprising everyone by speaking up. "I've served on the HOA board for 3 years, and I've witnessed the pattern myself. We apply more scrutiny to certain residents. We always have a reason, but the consistency of who receives that scrutiny should give us pause." As the formal session wound down, people broke into smaller conversation groups. Catherine found herself approached by Diane and 2 other Oakwood mothers who had previously kept their distance. "Thank you for coming tonight," Diane said quietly. "It wasn't an easy choice, I know." Across the room, Marcus was deep in conversation with a group of community college students when Officer Ramirez approached. "Powerful session," Ramirez said, extending his hand, "especially the personal stories." "Thank you for coming," Marcus replied, genuinely appreciative. "Not an easy position for you to be in." Ramirez nodded. "I've been thinking about something you said, about how neutrality in the face of discrimination actually perpetuates it. As officers, we're called to respond to suspicious person reports without questioning the underlying assumptions." He hesitated. "I've started raising these issues in our department training sessions." Nearby, Zoe engaged with one of the speakers, her thoughtful questions drawing smiles from the adults around her. "If HOAs are required to make their enforcement data public," she was asking, "wouldn't that create accountability for bias in citations?" Amara, overhearing, gestured for the others to listen as the teenager continued her impressively nuanced inquiry. "Transparency creates accountability," Amara affirmed when Zoe finished. "That's exactly the kind of structural change that could make a difference." The following morning, Marcus was sipping coffee at his desk, when Channel 8 News began a segment on the forum. A community education initiative launched by civil rights attorney Marcus Johnson drew an unexpectedly diverse crowd last night, including several members of the Oakwood Estates HOA board currently facing a discrimination lawsuit. The camera panned across the engaged audience, lingering briefly on Catherine and the HOA board members in attendance. The Community Conversations series aims to address housing discrimination and racial bias in suburban communities. Organizers described the first session as a successful beginning to what they hope will be an ongoing dialogue. A brief clip showed Amara explaining the historical context of housing segregation, followed by a soundbite from Marcus. This isn't about villainizing individuals. It's about recognizing and dismantling systems that perpetuate inequality, often without our conscious awareness. The reporter continued. Local response has been mixed, with some community members praising the initiative, while others question its timing amid ongoing litigation. Marcus's phone rang. Catherine, calling earlier than her usual morning check-in, about the children. "I just saw the news segment," she said without preamble. "My phone's been buzzing nonstop. Karen's absolutely furious that I attended." "I appreciate that you came," Marcus said. "It couldn't have been easy." "Actually, it was easier than I expected," Catherine admitted. "For weeks I've felt isolated, caught between worlds. But last night I realized there are others in Oakwood who share my concerns." She paused. "Zoe hasn't stopped talking about it. She's already working on some proposal for her school about transparency in disciplinary actions by race." Marcus smiled despite himself. She's always been one to channel feelings into action. "Like her father," Catherine observed, then hesitated. "My lawyer called this morning. Karen's legal team has requested my deposition next week." The news sobered Marcus immediately. "Catherine, you should know—" "I know what it means," she interrupted. "I'll be under oath, forced to either defend Karen's actions or acknowledge they were discriminatory." Her voice steadied. "I've made my decision, Marcus. I'm going to tell the truth, whatever it costs me socially." After they hung up, Marcus sat contemplating the unexpected ripple effects of the forum. One evening of honest conversation had already shifted something fundamental in the community dynamics. People who had been silently uncomfortable were finding their voices. Those who had felt isolated were discovering allies. His phone buzzed with a text from Amara. "Have you seen this?" Attached was a screenshot of Richard Powell's private Facebook post to Karen's supporters. Last night's propaganda session was recorded by the media. Any Oakwood resident who participated has chosen their side against the community. The HOA will remember who its true supporters are when making future decisions. The thinly veiled threat confirmed what Marcus had suspected. As the education initiative gained momentum, resistance would intensify. The lawsuit was moving into deposition phase, where Karen and others would face direct questioning about their motivations and actions. The coming weeks would force everyone involved to stake their positions clearly. Yet even as the conflict escalated, something else was emerging. A genuine conversation about the community Oakwood residents wanted to build. The education initiative had created space for voices long silenced or ignored, and those voices were growing stronger. As Marcus prepared for the depositions to come, he felt cautiously optimistic. The path forward remained difficult, but for the first time since the incident in the parking lot, he sensed the possibility of genuine change, not just for his family but for the community as a whole. The Wilson and Pratt law offices occupied the 32nd floor of a sleek downtown high-rise, far removed from Oakwood's manicured lawns. Inside Conference Room C, with blinds drawn tight, Karen Whitfield sat rigidly across from Amelia Stallworth, Marcus's law partner. A court reporter and videographer documented everything, while Marcus observed silently from the corner. "Ms. Whitfield," Amelia began with deceptive gentleness, "please state for the record what specific behaviors you observed that led you to call the police on April 14th. Karen glanced at her attorney before answering. "I observed an unknown individual lingering in our private community, pacing in the guest area, and appearing to look at homes. And in your judgment, What made these actions suspicious rather than someone simply waiting? Oakwood Estates is a private, gated community. Security is our priority. Unknown individuals represent a potential security risk. During your time as HOA president, approximately how many times have you personally called police to report suspicious persons? Perhaps 15 to 20 times over my 3-year tenure. I see. Of the 17 documented calls you've made, 15 were regarding Black or Hispanic individuals. The remaining 2 concerned teenage skateboarders. How do you explain this pattern? Karen's attorney interjected. Objection. Assumes facts, not in evidence. My client doesn't track the race of individuals she reports. Let me rephrase. Ms. Whitfield, are you aware that over 88% of your calls concerned people of color, in a county where people of color represent only 27% of the population? Karen's nails pressed into her palm beneath the table. I respond to suspicious behavior, not race. Let's examine what constitutes suspicious behavior in your assessment. Amelia slid a tablet across the table, showing a still from Marcus's video. This is Mr. Johnson waiting by his car. What specific behaviors made this suspicious? Karen stared at the image, seeing for the first time how ordinary the scene appeared. A well-dressed man checking his phone beside a luxury sedan. He was pacing, she said, her voice less certain. The video shows him standing by his car for 12 minutes, then walking once around the guest area before returning. Is that what you consider pacing? He seemed out of place. Could you elaborate on what made him seem out of place? Karen hesitated, sensing the trap. He wasn't a resident I recognized. Do you personally know every resident of the 237 homes in Oakwood Estates? Not every resident, no, but do you call police on every person you don't recognize in Oakwood? Of course not. Then what specific factor made Mr. Johnson warrant a call to police when other unrecognized individuals do not? The question hung in the air. Karen glanced at her attorney, whose subtle grimace conveyed the corner she'd backed herself into. It was a combination of factors. His behavior seemed unusual for our community. Unusual in what way? He didn't appear to have a clear purpose for being there. Despite standing beside his car in a designated guest area, having entered with a valid gate code. For the first time, Karen's confidence visibly wavered. In retrospect, perhaps I acted hastily. The deposition continued for 4 more grueling hours, meticulously dissecting every aspect of Karen's decision-making process. By the end, her perfect composure had deteriorated, and the first seeds of genuine doubt had taken root in her mind. 2 days later, Richard Powell sat in the same chair, his answers clipped and carefully phrased to avoid admissions. Mr. Powell, said Jordan Kim, handling this deposition, as chairman of the HOA's Security Committee, you helped draft the visitor registration policy implemented last year, correct? Yes. The committee unanimously recommended it to the board. What specific security incidents prompted this policy? We had concerns about unauthorized individuals accessing community amenities. Could you cite specific incidents? There were reports of unknown teenagers using the community pool, and concerns about non-residents walking dogs in the common areas. Yet the HOA minutes from that period mention no formal complaints. What evidence supported the need for this? Policy change? Community sentiment, residents expressed concerns. The policy was implemented 2 weeks after the Washingtons, a Black family, moved into Oakwood. Was that timing coincidental? Richard's jaw tightened. Completely. Yet in emails obtained through discovery, you wrote to Karen Whitfield that the policy would help maintain community standards as demographics shift. What did you mean by that? Richard looked uncomfortable. That was poorly phrased. I meant that as the community grows, we need consistent standards. In another email from the same time, you wrote, the Maple Street situation requires monitoring. We can't stop them from buying, but we can enforce every regulation to the letter. What situation were you referring to? Richard's attorney interjected. Objection. The question lacks context. The context is clear in the email thread, Jordan replied calmly. The previous messages explicitly discuss the Washington family's purchase of the home on Maple Street. Richard's expression hardened. I don't recall the specific context of that message. Let me refresh your memory, Jordan said, showing a printed email chain. This exchange occurred 3 days after Dr. Amara Washington and her family completed their purchase. You expressed concerns about changing neighborhood character. Would you care to explain what you meant? As Richard struggled to reframe his documented statements, the pattern of selective enforcement became increasingly difficult to deny. Catherine's deposition presented a different challenge. Unlike Karen and Richard, she was navigating the painful position of testifying truthfully while still having to live in the community she was effectively testifying against. Ms. Pearson, Amelia began gently, please describe your understanding of what occurred on April 14th. Catherine took a steadying breath. Marcus texted me when he arrived. I told him I needed about 10 more minutes and gave him the gate code. While he was waiting, Karen called the police, reporting him as suspicious. Had you informed Ms. Whitfield that your ex-husband would be picking up your children? No, there's no requirement to notify neighbors of visitors. How did your children react to seeing their father questioned by police? Catherine's composure faltered. Zoe immediately understood what was happening. She's 14 and she's experienced enough to recognize racial profiling. Tyler was confused and frightened. He kept asking what his dad had done wrong. And what were the ongoing effects on your children? Tyler began having nightmares. His grades dropped. He became anxious about visiting public places with his father. Her voice grew stronger with protective instinct. Zoe became angry and isolated at school. She was targeted by other students whose parents supported Karen's actions. How would you characterize the community response in the weeks following the incident? Catherine looked directly at Marcus for the first time. Initially, most residents tried to avoid taking sides. After the lawsuit was filed, the community fractured. Many stopped speaking to me. My children became collateral damage in a neighborhood conflict they didn't create. The most unexpected turning point came during Officer Miguel Ramirez's deposition. Officer Ramirez, Amelia began, please describe the nature of the call you received on April 14th. Dispatch reported a suspicious person call from a resident. The caller specified a black male approximately 40 years old who appeared out of place and was looking at houses. Was this characterized as an emergency call? No, ma'am. It was a non-emergency call, but our department prioritizes responses to the Oakwood area due to their private security contract. And what did you observe when you arrived on scene? A well-dressed man standing beside a BMW sedan in the guest parking area, checking his phone. Nothing about his behavior appeared suspicious to me upon arrival. Yet you still approached and questioned him? Yes. Department policy requires us to respond to all calls even if we don't observe suspicious activity ourselves. At what point did you personally realize that Mr. Johnson posed no security threat? Immediately upon arrival, but protocol required completing the interaction. Your body camera footage shows your partner taking the lead in questioning Mr. Johnson. Was there a reason you remained more passive? Ramirez hesitated, glancing at the police department's attorney. I was uncomfortable with the nature of the call from the beginning. It appeared to be racially motivated rather than based on genuine security concerns. A subtle shift occurred in the room. This wasn't in the prepared testimony. Did you express this concern to your partner or supervisors? I attempted to suggest we clear the call quickly, but was overruled. After the incident, I filed a supplemental report noting my concerns about the nature of the call. Has that report been made part of the official record? Ramirez's jaw tightened. No, it was declined by my supervisor as unnecessary. Officer Ramirez, are you aware that providing testimony contrary to the department's position could impact your career advancement? Yes, ma'am, I am. And yet you're still stating for the record that you believe this call was racially motivated? Yes, ma'am, because it's the truth. At Oakwood Preparatory Academy, the legal battle cast long shadows through the hallways. Zoe Johnson stood at her locker, ignoring whispers from a group of girls nearby. "My mom says your dad is trying to bankrupt the HOA with his lawsuit," said Madeline Wright, loud enough to ensure Zoe heard. "My dad says Karen's deposition was a disaster," another girl added. "She totally fell apart when they showed her all the time she'd called police on black people." Zoe clutched her books tightly. "Maybe if she hadn't racially profiled my father, none of this would be happening." "It wasn't racial profiling," Madeline insisted. "It was about community safety. My mom says your dad planned this whole thing. For attention. Your mom is entitled to her opinion. The court will decide based on evidence, not opinions." As she turned to walk away, Madeline called after her. "Nobody wants you here anyway. Why don't you just go live with your dad and leave Oakwood alone?" The words stung more than Zoe wanted to admit. Part of her had begun to wonder the same thing. Would it be easier to simply leave? But another part, the part that had inherited her father's sense of justice, rebelled against retreating from wrongdoing rather than confronting it. In another part of the school, Tyler's teacher, Ms. Bingham, sat with Catherine and Marcus in a parent-teacher conference. "Tyler's always been a bright, engaged student," Ms. Bingham explained, "but in the past month he's become withdrawn. His last 2 math assignments were incomplete, and during recess he often sits alone." "Has he mentioned any specific issues?" Marcus asked, concerned father eclipsing lawyer. "Not directly, but yesterday during a writing exercise about community helpers, he wrote that police officers help some people but not others. When I asked him to elaborate, he became upset." Catherine and Marcus exchanged pained glances. Their son was struggling to reconcile the simple worldview of a 10-year-old with the complex realities of bias he'd experienced firsthand. "We've arranged for him to speak with a child psychologist," Catherine said, "but it's difficult when the environment constantly reopens the wound." Ms. Bingham nodded sympathetically. "I understand you're in a challenging situation. I just want you both to know that I'm keeping a close eye on Tyler and creating space for him to express his feelings when he's ready." As they left, Marcus spoke quietly. "The second community conversation is next week. I think it might be good for the kids to see positive action coming from all this." "Zoe wants to attend. She's even prepared questions," Catherine replied. "But Tyler, he's retreating from everything connected to the incident. The HOA's insurance company contacted our firm today. They're suggesting settlement talks." "Already? That seems fast." Officer Ramirez's testimony changed the landscape. Between his statements, the body camera footage, and the pattern evidence from Richard's emails, they're looking at significant potential damages if this goes to trial. "How does Karen feel about settlement talks?" According to their attorney, she's furious. She still doesn't believe she did anything wrong. "She's losing control of the narrative," Catherine observed. "That's what really bothers her, not being able to shape how people see her." The following Thursday evening, the community college auditorium was filled beyond capacity for the second community conversation. Where the first event had drawn around 40 participants, this one had over 90. Marcus watched in amazement as Amara adjusted the microphone. "I didn't expect this turnout," he whispered. "The depositions becoming public changed everything," she replied. "People who were on the fence are now curious." She nodded toward several HOA board members who had previously aligned with Karen. "The evidence is becoming too clear to ignore." During the Q&A, one of Karen's former allies stood. "I've been on the HOA Architectural Review Committee for 5 years, she said, her voice unsteady. "After hearing about the enforcement statistics revealed in the depositions, I reviewed our approval records. Applications from white homeowners had a 97% first submission approval rate. For homeowners of color, it was 42%. She paused. "I didn't see the pattern until I actively looked for it. I'm not sure what to do with this information. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Amara nodded encouragingly. "Awareness is the first step. The next is accountability, followed by changed practices. Would you be willing to present those findings at an HOA meeting?" The woman hesitated before nodding. Yes, it's the right thing to do. From the middle of the audience, Zoe raised her hand. When called upon, she stood, with remarkable poise. The testimony from Officer Ramirez showed how institutions often pressure individuals to remain silent about discrimination. She said clearly, what structural changes could prevent this kind of institutional silencing? A ripple of impressed murmurs moved through the audience. Marcus felt pride in his daughter's insight mixed with heartache that she had to develop such understanding so young. As the session concluded, Marcus noticed Catherine deep in conversation with several Oakwood mothers who had previously avoided her. Officer Ramirez stood near the refreshment table, now openly engaging with attendees despite the professional risk his testimony had created. Outside the auditorium, Richard Powell watched from his car, documenting which residents attended. His phone rang, Karen demanding an update. It's worse than last time, he reported. At least 90 people, including half the architectural committee and 3 of your strongest board supporters. They're betraying the community, Karen said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Karen, Richard said carefully, the insurance company is pushing hard for settlement. The evidence from the depositions is damaging. We need to consider our options. Settlement implies wrongdoing, she insisted. Sometimes it's just the practical choice. The policy will cover financial damages, but it can't protect your reputation if this goes to trial and all the evidence becomes completely public. The line went silent before Karen spoke again. I need to think. For the first time, Richard allowed himself to consider whether he had aligned himself with the wrong side of history. The emails revealed in his deposition had exposed biases he'd couched in terms of community standards but which, laid bare, appeared unmistakably prejudiced. Inside the auditorium, as the crowd dispersed, Marcus received a text from Jordan. Civil rights blogger Aisha Taylor requesting interview about case. Has 3M followers. Could go national. Marcus showed the message to Amara, whose eyebrows rose. That would change the dynamic significantly. Are you prepared for that level of attention? Tyler appeared at his side. Dad, is it almost over? Marcus knelt to his son's eye level. Yes, buddy, we're wrapping up. What did you think? Tyler looked around at the dispersing crowd. There's a lot more people than last time. That's because more people are starting to care about doing the right thing. Tyler considered this, with the serious contemplation of a 10-year-old. Is that why you're doing all this, because it's right even though it's hard? Marcus felt the question settle into his core, the simple wisdom of children cutting through complications to essential truth. Exactly that, Tyler. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard, but that doesn't make it any less right. As they gathered their materials, Marcus considered the text again. The potential national attention would intensify pressure on Oakwood, potentially accelerating settlement talks. But it would also thrust his family into an even more painful spotlight. The lawsuit had begun as a response to a personal injustice, but it had evolved into something larger, a challenge to systems of exclusion that operated beneath the surface of communities like Oakwood across the country. He texted Jordan back, set up the interview. It's time more communities have this conversation. The interview with civil rights blogger Aisha Taylor lasted exactly 47 minutes. Marcus had expected a brief conversation, perhaps a few quotes, for her website. Instead, they'd had an in-depth discussion about housing discrimination, the subtle enforcement of racial boundaries in affluent communities, and the personal toll of standing against systemic bias. 3 days later, at 6:17 a.m., Marcus's phone began buzzing incessantly. Emails, texts, calls, all alerting him to Aisha's newly published article. When Waiting While Black Becomes a Crime, How One Father's School Pickup Exposed America's Neighborhood. Apartheid. The piece included Marcus's full video, embedded court documents from the depositions, and a meticulously researched history of Oakwood Estate's demographics and enforcement patterns. By 9 a.m., the article had been shared over 50,000 times. By noon, national news networks were running segments on the story. Marcus stood in his office, watching CNN's coverage with a mixture of validation and alarm. This is exactly what we needed for the case, Jordan said, joining him. Joining. Public pressure will force them to settle. And what about the pressure on my children? Marcus asked quietly. This was never supposed to become a national crusade. His phone rang again. Catherine, her voice tense. There are 3 news. Vans outside the Oakwood gates. Security isn't letting them in, but they're interviewing residents as they leave for work. Someone just knocked on my door asking for a statement. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the situation rapidly spinning, beyond his control. Don't answer the door, don't talk to anyone. I'll call the school and let them know what's happening. Zoe is handling it better than I expected, Catherine continued. She's actually reading the article and the comments. But Tyler is terrified. He thinks the people outside want to hurt us. I'll pick them up after school personally, Marcus promised. We'll figure this out. As he hung up, Amelia appeared in his doorway. Marcus, you need to see this. She handed him her tablet. Open. To a Twitter thread, someone had gone through Richard Powell's social media history and compiled dozens of problematic posts spanning years. Jokes about minority neighborhoods, comments about preserving community character, and direct responses to news stories about police shootings defending officers regardless of circumstances. This is getting ugly fast, Amelia observed. The internet is doing its own discovery process now. Marcus scrolled through the growing thread, watching in real time as Richard Powell's public persona unraveled. He's the least of my concerns right now. I need to protect my family from this spotlight. By evening, the story had fully erupted. Oakwood racism was trending nationally. Major outlets had picked up footage of Karen's previous interviews defending her actions, juxtaposing them with the damning statistics from the depositions. Online sleuths had compiled lists of HOA board members, with many receiving emails and calls at their workplaces. Karen Whitfield sat in her darkened living room, blinds drawn tight against the camera lenses occasionally visible through the slats. Her phone, which she'd finally silenced after hours of incessant notifications, displayed an email from her sister in Phoenix. Your address is circulating online. Come stay with us until this blows over. The HOA attorneys had called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning, but she wasn't sure she could bring herself to leave the house. The comments under Aisha Taylor's article and across social media platforms had shaken her profoundly. Not just angry disagreement, but visceral hatred from thousands of strangers who now saw her as the embodiment of entitled racism. When her doorbell rang, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Peering through the peephole, she was relieved to see Richard Powell rather than another reporter. You need to pack a bag, he said grimly when she opened the door. It's not safe for you to stay here right now. Karen's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her cardigan closed. This is insane. I called the police because someone looked suspicious. Now I'm being driven from my home? Richard glanced nervously over his shoulder. Karen, this isn't just about the lawsuit anymore. My social media history is being torn apart online. I've received threats. My wife is terrified. His weathered face looked suddenly older. The board is asking for my resignation. They can't do that. You've been on the board for 12 years. They can and they are. Public pressure is too intense. He ran a hand over his face. I've submitted my resignation effective immediately. I'm advising you to do the same. Karen stared at him, this pillar of community authority now crumbling before her eyes. I can't just surrender. That would be admitting I did something wrong. Karen, Richard said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, at this point it's not about right or wrong anymore. It's about survival. The settlement offer is the best path forward, for the community and for you personally. After he left, Karen finally opened her work email to find a dozen messages from clients terminating their real estate contracts with her. 2 were explicitly cited her racist actions as the reason. 3 more simply stated they were going in a different direction. For the first time since her divorce 5 years earlier, Karen Whitfield felt the foundations of her carefully constructed life truly collapsing. She began packing a suitcase, with mechanical movements, unsure where she was going but certain she couldn't stay. Catherine Pearson had never considered herself particularly confrontational. Throughout her marriage to Marcus, she'd often been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflict rather than engaging directly. But as she stood on her front lawn facing a photographer with a telephoto lens pointed at her children's bedroom windows, something primal and fierce awakened within her. "You need to leave immediately," she stated, voice steady but hard. "Those are minors you're trying to photograph without consent." The photographer lowered his camera slightly. "This is a public street, ma'am. I have every right—" "You have no right to terrorize children who are already traumatized," Catherine interrupted, stepping closer. "My children are not your story. They are not your clickbait. They are kids trying to feel safe in their own home." From the doorway, Zoe watched her mother with new eyes, seeing a strength she hadn't fully appreciated before. When another reporter approached with a microphone, Catherine's response was equally firm. "My ex-husband and I share the goal of raising children who stand against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. If you want to support that goal, you can respect their privacy and focus on the systemic issues instead of treating our family like entertainment." By the time Marcus arrived to pick up the children, Catherine had successfully cleared the immediate area around their home. As they transferred the kids' overnight bags to his car, he looked at her with genuine admiration. "Amelia mentioned you've been remarkable through all this." Catherine brushed hair from her face, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm just protecting our children." "You're doing more than that," Marcus said. "You're showing them what courage looks like." Inside Oakwood Estates, the atmosphere had transformed from tension to siege. Residents who had nothing to do with Karen's actions or the HOA's policies found themselves cast as extras in a national morality play, scrutinized when entering or leaving their neighborhood, judged for where they had chosen to live. Sensing the growing community stress, Amara Washington organized an emergency support meeting for families in her home. 27 residents attended, including several who had previously aligned with Karen. "The goal tonight isn't to debate the lawsuit or choose sides," Amara explained to the anxious faces around her living room. "It's to acknowledge that this sudden spotlight is affecting everyone, especially children. How can we create safe spaces during this difficult time?" One mother raised her hand hesitantly. "My daughter is in Zoe's class. She's afraid to talk to her now because she doesn't know what to say. But they used to be friends. How do we help our children navigate this?" "By acknowledging the awkwardness directly," Amara suggested. "By giving them permission to say, 'This is hard, and I don't know the perfect thing to say, but I still care about you.'" As the conversation continued, residents began sharing their confusion, fear, and in some cases, emerging awareness of biases they hadn't previously recognized. It wasn't a formal educational forum like the community conversations, but something more organic, a neighborhood beginning to process collective trauma and responsibility. "The cameras will eventually leave," Amara reminded them as the evening concluded. "The question is, what kind of community will remain when they do? That's entirely up to us." The third community conversation, hastily rescheduled to accommodate media interest, moved to the main auditorium at the community college. Local television stations set up equipment for live coverage, and residents had to pass through a gauntlet of reporters to enter. Inside, Marcus and Amara had made a deliberate choice to shift the focus from Oakwood specifically to the broader patterns it represented. A panel of housing experts, civil rights attorneys, and community organizers discussed how seemingly neutral policies could perpetuate segregation and discrimination. "What's happening in Oakwood Estates isn't unique," explained a housing policy researcher. "Communities across America use coded language about property values and neighborhood character to maintain racial homogeneity. The difference here is that someone with the resources and knowledge to challenge the system chose to do so." In the audience, Officer Ramirez sat in uniform, no longer hiding his presence or perspective. Earlier that day, he had given an interview to the local news about the need for police reform in responding to suspicious person calls. "Officers need better training to recognize when we're being used as instruments of private bias," he had stated firmly, "and we need the institutional support to decline response when calls are clearly racially motivated." His comments had earned him a formal reprimand from his department, but also a groundswell of support from reform-minded colleagues. His career advancement might be compromised, but his conscience was clear. As the forum concluded, Zoe approached the microphone during audience questions. The room quieted, cameras pivoting toward the poised 14-year-old at the center of the storm. Most discussions about discrimination focus on adults making policy changes, she observed. But as students, we experience these same patterns in school. I've started a discussion group for students to talk about how racial bias affects our educational experience. My question is, what resources exist to help young people lead these conversations constructively? Marcus watched his daughter with a complex mixture of pride and heartache. She had found purpose in the painful spotlight, channeling her experience into advocacy. But the weight on her young shoulders seemed unfair, a burden no child should have to carry. At his therapist's office, Tyler sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully arranging miniature figures in the sand tray. Dr. Reynolds observed quietly as the 10-year-old created a walled community, with figures standing inside and outside the boundary. "Can you tell me about what you're making?" she asked gently. Tyler pointed to a figure standing outside the wall. "This is Dad. He's not allowed inside because the people don't know him." He moved another figure, a child, to stand beside the EO. "First, this is me. I'm trying to help Dad get in, but the people inside don't listen to kids." "That must feel frustrating," Dr. Reynolds observed. Tyler nodded, adding more figures inside the walls. "These people are scared. They think Dad is bad, but they don't even know him." He paused, considering. "Some of them are starting to listen now, though." He moved a few figures closer to the wall. "These ones are thinking maybe they made a mistake." Dr. Reynolds noted the complexity of Tyler's understanding, his awareness not just of injustice but of people's capacity to reconsider their positions. "Is there anything good happening because of this difficult situation?" Tyler thought for a moment before nodding. "More people are talking about important things now, and Dad says that's how things get better." The HOA board's emergency meeting took place in the community center, with a police presence ensuring no media disrupted the proceedings. The insurance company's attorney presented a stark financial reality. "The settlement offer on the table is our best option," he explained to the anxious board members. "If this proceeds to trial, the potential damages could exceed our policy limits, leaving board members personally liable. Moreover, the public relations damage is already substantial." Diane Chen, who had stepped into the interim president role after Karen's departure, surveyed her colleagues. "Before we vote, I want to be clear. This isn't just about financial risk. It's about acknowledging that our community has systemic issues we need to address. The settlement agreement includes policy reforms that are necessary regardless of this case's outcome." The vote was nearly unanimous, with only one holdout still loyal to Karen's position. As they filed out after the meeting, board members faced a barrage of questions from residents who had gathered outside. What does this mean for our property values? Will our HOA fees increase to cover the settlement? Is Karen being removed permanently from the board? Diane addressed them with newfound authority. The board has voted to accept the settlement offer, which includes financial compensation to the Johnson family and mandatory reforms to our enforcement policies. Yes, there will be a special assessment to cover costs not included in our insurance coverage. And yes, Karen Whitfield has submitted her resignation from the board. The news spread rapidly through the community and to the media encampment outside the gates. Within an hour, Marcus received the formal notification from his legal team. The lawsuit that had begun as a response to a personal injustice was resolving into structural change. Policy reforms, transparency requirements, and mandatory bias training for all HOA board members. Yet as he watched the continuing media coverage that evening, Marcus felt strangely hollow. The settlement represented a form of justice, but it couldn't erase the trauma his children had experienced. It couldn't restore their sense of safety, or erase the memory of seeing their father humiliated. The victory seemed incomplete, the resolution unsatisfying in ways he struggled to articulate. His phone chimed with a text from Catherine. Just heard about the settlement. Cameras finally leaving. Is this really over? Marcus stared at the message, contemplating the layers of meaning in her simple question. The lawsuit might be concluding, but the deeper work of healing, for his children, for Catherine, for the community, perhaps even for Karen herself, was only beginning. The legal battle is ending, he replied carefully. The real work continues. He looked up at the television where a pundit was already using Oakwood as an example in a broader debate about race in America. Their personal pain had become a public parable, their neighborhood transformed into a symbol. The story had outgrown them, taking on meanings and dimensions they could no longer control. As Marcus turned off the television, he wondered what would remain when the spotlight finally shifted elsewhere. The policy changes were concrete, but the human transformation, the shifted perspectives, the awakened consciences, the damaged relationships, would continue long after the cameras departed. Some wounds might heal, others would leave permanent scars. And Oakwood Estates would never be quite the same community it had been before Karen Whitfield looked out her window and saw threat instead of humanity in a father waiting for his children. 3 weeks after fleeing the media spotlight, Karen Whitfield returned to her Oakwood home in the pre-dawn darkness. The news vans had departed, but she still entered through her garage, unwilling to risk being seen. Despite everything, Oakwood was home. The community she had helped shape, the place where she had rebuilt her life after her divorce. Inside, a stack of mail awaited her. She sorted through it mechanically until reaching an envelope bearing the logo of Westside Properties, her largest client. The letter was brief but devastating. Given recent events and the impact on our brand reputation, we regret to inform you that Westside Properties will no longer require your real estate services. Karen set the letter down, trembling slightly. Westside represented nearly 30% of her annual income. Combined with the 5 clients who had already terminated their relationships, her business was effectively crippled. At mid-morning, restless and unable to focus on her remaining work, Karen decided to swim laps at the community pool. At this hour on a weekday, it would likely be deserted. The pool area was indeed empty when she arrived. Karen swam methodically, finding brief solace in physical exertion. After 30 minutes, she pulled herself onto the pool deck for a short rest. That's when she noticed him. Tyler Johnson, sitting alone at a table near the fence, a half-eaten sandwich and open book before him. Before she could decide whether to retreat, Tyler looked up. Recognition flashed across his face, followed immediately by fear. He quickly gathered his things, stuffing them into his backpack. "Wait," Karen called instinctively. "You don't have to leave." Tyler paused, his body language conveying a wariness no 10-year-old should possess. "My mom will be back in a minute," he said, though Karen suspected this was a protective lie. "That's fine," she replied, maintaining her distance. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Tyler hesitated, clearly uncomfortable but reluctant to leave his lunch. Karen noticed how his eyes darted toward the gate periodically, checking for escape routes. "I'm afraid of you," he said suddenly, the childish bluntness startling her. Karen felt the words like a physical blow. "I understand why you would be," she said softly. "I'm sorry about what happened to your dad." Tyler studied her, his young face showing complex emotion. "Dad says you were scared too, that sometimes people do wrong things when they're scared." The child's simple insight pierced through Karen's carefully constructed defenses. Had she been scared that day? Not physically, but perhaps of something else. Of change, of difference, of losing control over the carefully ordered world she'd built. "Your dad is a wise man," she said finally. "He says we should try to understand why people do bad things, but that doesn't make the bad things okay." "He's right about that too." A silence settled between them, not comfortable but no longer actively hostile. Tyler returned to his sandwich, still watchful but less poised for flight. "I have bad dreams sometimes," he volunteered unexpectedly, "about police taking my dad away and me never seeing him again." Karen felt something crack inside her, the defensive shell she'd maintained since the incident. For the first time, she truly saw the human consequences of her actions, not in abstract terms of legal liability or damaged reputation, but in the nightmares of a child who feared losing his father. "I'm truly sorry, Tyler," she said, her voice thick with genuine emotion. "What I did was wrong, and I wish I could take it back." From the entrance came Catherine's voice, sharp with alarm. "Tyler? Tyler, where are you?" "Over here, Mom," he called, his eyes still on Karen. Catherine rushed in, stopping abruptly when she saw her son engaged in conversation with Karen. Her face hardened as she moved protectively to Tyler's side. "It's time to go," she said firmly. Karen remained seated, making no move to approach them. "Catherine, I just want to say—" "Not now," Catherine interrupted. "Not through my child." Karen nodded, accepting the boundary. "Of course. I understand." As Catherine led Tyler away, the boy looked back once, offering a small wave that contained more wisdom and grace than Karen felt she deserved. Alone again by the pool, Karen faced an uncomfortable truth. She had been wrong. Not just legally vulnerable or politically unwise, but fundamentally, humanly wrong in her actions and their impact. In the conference room of Stallworth and Johnson, Law, Marcus reviewed the final settlement proposal with his partners. The terms were substantial: a six-figure payment to the Johnson family for emotional distress, mandatory bias training for all HOA board members, revision of enforcement policies, with quarterly auditing for racial disparities, and a formal commitment to increasing diversity in community leadership. "Financially and structurally, it's everything we asked for," Amelia noted. "The only sticking point is their refusal to include an admission of wrongdoing." Marcus frowned. "That's not insignificant. Without acknowledging the discriminatory nature of the actions, the narrative becomes about appeasing an angry minority, rather than addressing systemic bias." "True," Jordan agreed. "But a public trial would mean months of additional stress on your children with no guarantee of a better outcome." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Officer Ramirez entered in civilian clothes, his off-duty demeanor noticeably more relaxed than when they'd first met. "Your testimony was crucial to getting this settlement offer," Marcus acknowledged. "I understand it came at professional cost to you." Ramirez nodded. "Worth it, though. I became an officer to serve the community, not to enforce private biases." He gestured toward the settlement documents. "Is that the final proposal?" "Almost final," Marcus replied. "We're still pushing for an admission that racial bias motivated the original incident." Ramirez considered this thoughtfully. "In my 15 years as an officer, I've never once heard a person admit racial bias, even when it was unmistakable to everyone else. People will acknowledge poor judgment, miscommunication, even procedural errors, but explicit bias? Almost never." "So you think we should accept the settlement without the admission?" Marcus asked. "I think you should consider what victory really looks like here," Ramirez replied. "Is it a reluctant statement crafted by attorneys that Karen Whitfield doesn't believe? Or is it actual change in how the community operates?" After Ramirez departed, Marcus sat with his thoughts, weighing justice against healing, principle against pragmatism. His phone chimed with a message from Catherine. "Amara and I are organizing a community healing circle next week. Several HOA board members want to participate. Would you consider joining?" The invitation presented a different kind of resolution, not legal or financial, but human and communal. "I'll be there," he replied. The community healing circle took place in the airy great room of Amara's home. The space had been arranged with chairs in a perfect circle, no hierarchy. A simple candle burned in the center. The participants arrived, gradually: Diane Chen and 3 other HOA board members, 2 families who had shared discrimination experiences at the community conversations, Officer Ramirez and his wife, Marcus, Zoe, and Tyler, Richard Powell, looking uncomfortable but determined, and lastly, Karen Whitfield, who entered tentatively. An awkward silence fell as Karen took the only remaining seat, directly across from Marcus. Catherine, seated beside her ex-husband, reached over to squeeze his hand briefly, a small gesture of support that spoke volumes about their evolving relationship. "Thank you all for coming," Amara began. "This isn't about blame or defensiveness. It's about honest sharing of experiences and impacts. We begin by acknowledging that harm has occurred in our community. Harm that affects all of us, though in different ways." What followed was 2 hours of careful, sometimes painful conversation. Diane Chen shared her growing awareness of how she had remained silent while observing discriminatory patterns in HOA enforcement. A black homeowner described the exhaustion of constantly proving he belonged in his own neighborhood. Richard Powell acknowledged that his law enforcement background had reinforced biases he was only now beginning to recognize. When it came to Tyler's turn, he spoke with the directness only children possess. "I used to think police were always the good guys," he said. "Now I know it's more complicated. Some rules aren't fair, even if people say they're for safety." Zoe followed her brother with composed eloquence. "This experience changed how I see everything, not just Oakwood, but school, social media, even history. I started a discussion group at school because students need space to talk about these things too." When Karen's turn came, she took a deep breath. "I've lost my business, my position, many of my friends, and my sense of security," she began. "For a long time I told myself I was the victim of political correctness gone wild. But recently," she glanced briefly at Tyler, "I've had to face that my actions caused real harm, especially to children who did nothing wrong." She turned to face Marcus directly. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I am truly sorry for what I did that day and for defending it afterward. It was wrong." A palpable shift occurred in the room, an easing of tension, a collective exhale. The acknowledgement Karen had been unwilling to make in legal documents emerged organically in the presence of the community she had harmed. Marcus nodded, accepting her words without immediately responding. When his turn came, he spoke with measured care. "I filed this lawsuit because systems don't change without pressure, but systems are made of people capable of growth and transformation." He looked around the circle. "What happens in Oakwood matters beyond Oakwood. The patterns here exist across America. By addressing them honestly in our community, we create possibility elsewhere." As the circle concluded, conversations continued, in smaller groups. Marcus found himself engaged in an unexpected conversation with 2 HOA board members. "We'd like you to consider joining the board when elections happen next month," Diane Chen said. "We need your perspective and expertise as we implement the settlement requirements." Marcus looked surprised. "You realize that might be controversial for some residents." "Exactly why it's necessary," Diane replied. "Symbolic representation matters, but so does actual power sharing." Later, as the gathering dispersed, Amara noticed Karen lingering. When the others had departed, Karen approached her hesitantly. "Could we talk sometime?" she asked. "I have questions about how to understand my own biases better, about how to make amends beyond words." Amara studied the woman who had once viewed her as an unwelcome disruption to the community. "Of course," she said. "Growth begins with difficult questions. My door is open when you're ready." The final community conversation took place exactly 2 months after the incident that had catalyzed so much change. The auditorium was filled beyond capacity, not with media this time, but with residents from Oakwood and surrounding communities eager to hear about the lessons learned. The settlement had been finalized the previous week. Oakwood Estates HOA had officially adopted new enforcement policies, established a diversity and inclusion committee, and committed to regular auditing of its practices. As the event concluded, Amara invited Zoe to the podium to read an essay she had written for school, which had subsequently won a statewide contest on civic engagement. "My essay is called When the Gates Open: What I Learned When My Father Was Profiled in Our Community," she began. With remarkable poise, Zoe shared a perspective that blended a child's emotional honesty with emerging intellectual rigor. She spoke about watching her father be humiliated, about her brother's nightmares, about her own anger and confusion. But she also spoke about witnessing adults acknowledge mistakes and work toward repair, about the complexity of community building, across difference, and about her growing understanding that true safety came not from exclusion, but from connection. The gates of Oakwood were designed to keep some people out, she concluded. But the real barriers were invisible, assumptions, fears, and biases that divided us even as neighbors. When we chose to examine those barriers honestly, we didn't weaken our community. We began to build a stronger one, founded not on exclusion, but on justice and genuine belonging. The audience rose in standing ovation as Zoe returned to her seat between Marcus and Catherine. Tyler beamed at his sister with unabashed pride. Even Karen, seated near the back, joined the applause, her expression reflecting both sadness for what had been and cautious hope for what might still be. Outside the auditorium, as families dispersed into the warm evening, Marcus found himself momentarily alone with Catherine. "The kids are different," he observed. "Stronger in some ways, but also changed," Catherine finished. "They had to grow up faster than they should have, but they're also developing a moral clarity that will serve them throughout their lives." Marcus nodded. "Tyler asked if we won the lawsuit. I wasn't sure how to answer." "What did you tell him?" "That winning isn't always about defeating someone else. Sometimes it's about creating something better from something broken." Catherine considered this. "That's what we're trying to do with the community now. And maybe," she added thoughtfully, "with our family too, in its new form." As they walked toward the parking lot where Zoe and Tyler waited, Marcus reflected on the unexpected journey of the past 2 months. What had begun as a simple school pickup had transformed not just a neighborhood, but the people within it, including himself. The lawsuit was settled, but the deeper work of building a truly inclusive community was just beginning. He thought of Karen's difficult but genuine apology, of Officer Ramirez's courage in challenging his department's practices, of Amara's skillful bridge building, of Catherine's emerging strength, and of his children's remarkable resilience. None of these transformations had been in his legal strategy, yet they represented a form of justice perhaps more profound than anything a court could mandate. The path forward remained complex. Trust, once broken, required time and consistent action to rebuild. Policies, once changed, required vigilant implementation. And people, once awakened to their own biases, faced the ongoing work of personal transformation. But for the first time since the confrontation in the Oakwood guest parking area, Marcus felt genuine hope, not just for policy reform, but for human connection across the divides that had seemed unbridgeable only weeks before. In the fractured pieces of a community illusion, something more authentic and inclusive was tentatively emerging. As Tyler ran to meet him, no longer flinching at the sight of Officer Ramirez speaking with another family nearby, Marcus recognized the most meaningful victory of all: his son's cautious return to trust, to safety, to the childhood he deserved. Some wounds would leave scars, but healing had truly begun. The September sun cast golden light across the Oakwood Estates Community Center as residents gathered for the quarterly HOA meeting. 6 months had passed since Marcus Johnson had been questioned by police while waiting for his children. 6 months of upheaval, revelation, and gradual healing for a community forced to confront its hidden biases. Marcus sat at the board table reviewing his notes before the meeting began. His election to the HOA board 2 months earlier had been contentious but decisive, with 63% of voting residents supporting his candidacy. Tonight they would be unveiling the results of the first official audit of HOA enforcement actions, a cornerstone of the settlement agreement that had been finalized in early summer. "Nervous?" asked Diane Chen, who had transitioned from interim to elected board president. Marcus shook his head. "The data speaks for itself. The question is whether everyone is ready to hear it." The room filled steadily. Even Karen Whitfield was present, sitting quietly near the back. She no longer lived in Oakwood, having sold her house after losing her real estate business, but remained connected to the community through the education program required by the settlement. Their paths had crossed occasionally during community events, their interactions civil but distant. "I call this meeting to order," Diane announced once the room had settled. After handling routine business matters, she turned to the main agenda item. "As you know, part of our settlement agreement included quarterly auditing of enforcement actions to identify any patterns of bias. Marcus Johnson will present the findings of our first audit." Marcus stood conscious of the significance of the moment. A black attorney who had been reported to police for suspicious behavior, now standing in a position of authority in the very community that had once viewed him as an intruder. Third Q. Audit examined all enforcement actions over the past 6 months compared to historical data, he explained, displaying charts on the presentation screen. Previously, households of color received enforcement notices at a rate 3.7 times higher than white households for similar violations. Under our new policies, that disparity has been reduced to 1.3 times, still not equal, but a significant improvement. He continued with measured professionalism, detailing the changes implemented. Standardized violation reporting forms that required specific descriptions of infractions, photographic documentation of all cited violations, mandatory review of enforcement patterns by a diverse committee, and regular disclosure of anonymized enforcement data to the community. These reforms aren't just about numbers, Marcus concluded. They're about creating a community where everyone experiences the same rules applied in the same way. We still have work to do, but we're moving in the right direction. The discussion that followed was thoughtful rather than defensive. Questions focused on next steps, rather than debating whether biases had existed. A community that had once reacted with hostility to criticism had begun the difficult work of institutional reflection and reform. As the meeting adjourned, Karen approached Marcus, her demeanor tentative but determined. "The presentation was very clear," she said. I've been thinking we should talk. Properly, I mean, when you have time." Marcus studied her, noting, the changes 6 months had wrought. The perfectly coiffed, confidently imperious HOA president had been replaced by someone more subdued, more thoughtful. "I think that's overdue," he agreed. "Amara has offered to facilitate if that would be helpful." Karen nodded. "I'd appreciate that. I've been working with her in the education sessions. She's been instrumental in helping me understand things I didn't want to see before." They arranged to meet the following week, an encounter neither could have imagined during those tense moments when police officers had questioned Marcus about his right to be in Oakwood Estates. On a crisp Saturday morning, Catherine Pearson surveyed the preparations for the block party she had organized. Tables lined the communal green space, laden with food contributed by neighbors from diverse culinary traditions. A banner stretched between trees proclaimed "One Oakwood" in bright, inclusive colors designed by a committee of neighborhood children, including Tyler. "Mom, when are people coming?" Tyler asked, arranging chairs with meticulous precision. "Any minute now," Catherine replied, noting how her son's anxiety had evolved from fear to excited anticipation. The therapy sessions had helped tremendously, providing him space to process the trauma while rebuilding his sense of security. Zoe approached with a clipboard, every inch the emerging community organizer. "The welcome table is set up. I've got 5 volunteers to greet people and make sure everyone gets introduced to someone new." Catherine marveled at her daughter's transformation. The angry, isolated teenager of 6 months ago had channeled her pain into purpose, founding a student diversity coalition that had already implemented policy changes at Oakwood Preparatory Academy. Her essay about the family's experience had won a statewide civic engagement contest, earning her a scholarship and speaking opportunities that had boosted her confidence immensely. The first arrivals began trickling in, families Catherine had known for years but was only now truly getting to know. The divisions that had fractured Oakwood during the lawsuit had not disappeared entirely, but they had softened, with many former fence-sitters now actively engaged in community improvement efforts. Officer Ramirez arrived with his wife and children, no longer an awkward symbol of authority but a neighbor and ally. His principled stand during the lawsuit had cost him a promotion, but earned him a leadership position in designing new training protocols for community policing. The department had recently adopted his guidelines for evaluating suspicious person calls before dispatching officers, a policy change that would alter countless interactions beyond Oakwood. Amara Washington moved comfortably through the gathering. Her status in the community transformed from suspicious newcomer to respected leader. The community conversations series she had started with Marcus had become a permanent institution, drawing participants from surrounding neighborhoods and even city officials interested in replicating the model elsewhere. Catherine felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Marcus, who had arrived directly from his meeting with Karen and Amara. "How did it go?" she asked quietly. "Better than I expected," Marcus replied. "There were difficult moments, but also genuine ones. She's done a lot of work on herself these past months." "Do you forgive her?" Catherine asked, the question simpler than its complex answer. Marcus considered carefully. "Forgiveness suggests the ledger is balanced, the account closed. I think what we're building is more about moving forward with awareness than erasing the past." He paused, watching Tyler laugh with a group of children from diverse backgrounds. "But seeing our son healing, that makes space for something beyond anger." As the party hit full swing, Marcus and Catherine observed the transformed social landscape of Oakwood from the sidelines. Conversations flowed across racial and cultural lines that had previously served as invisible boundaries. Children played in mixed groups, oblivious to the social segregation that had once been the community norm. "We're hosting the Johnson family for dinner next week," Catherine mentioned. "The new family moving into the Palmer house?" Zoe connected with their daughter at school and invited them to see Oakwood before they move in. "That's quite a change from how new families of color were previously welcomed," Marcus observed. "That's partly why I wanted to do it," Catherine admitted. "To set a different tone from the beginning." Their conversation was interrupted by Diane Chen, who approached with an envelope. "The special assessment results," she explained, handing it to Marcus. "Every household in Oakwood contributed to the settlement payment. Not a single objection filed. The financial terms of the settlement had been substantial, with the community collectively responsible for covering what the HOA insurance didn't. The unanimous participation represented a community-wide acknowledgement of responsibility, a concrete demonstration that words of inclusion were being matched with action." 3 days later, Dr. Melissa Reynolds welcomed the Johnson family to their regular therapy session. Catherine and Marcus had committed to family counseling to help their children process their experiences, a decision that had proven valuable for all 4 of them. "Tyler, would you like to start today?" Dr. Reynolds suggested. "You mentioned last time you had something you wanted to share." Tyler nodded, his demeanor more confident than in early sessions. "I had a dream about police officers again," he began. "But this time it was different. I wasn't scared. I was explaining to them about bias like Officer Ramirez taught us in his presentation at school, and they were listening to me." Dr. Reynolds smiled encouragingly. "How did that make you feel?" "Strong," Tyler said, considering the word. "Like, I could help change things, not just be afraid of them." "That's a significant shift," Dr. Reynolds acknowledged. "Zoe, have you noticed any changes in your brother?" Zoe nodded. "He stood up for a kid at school last week when someone made a comment about his accent. Tyler told them it wasn't okay to make people feel like they don't belong." Marcus and Catherine exchanged glances, recognizing how their children were transforming painful experience into principled action, each in their own way. As the session continued, they discussed the upcoming move-in of the Johnson family, strategies for continued healing, and the balance between remembering past injustice and not being defined by it. "Marcus," Dr. Reynolds said as they were wrapping up, "you've been quieter than usual today. Any thoughts you'd like to share?" Marcus considered for a moment. "I've been reflecting on change, how some happens quickly through crisis or confrontation, while some requires patient, consistent effort over time. 6 months ago, I filed a lawsuit seeking justice. What we found instead is something more complex but perhaps more valuable, a community in transformation." Catherine reached for his hand. a gesture of solidarity that had become more frequent as they navigated their evolved co-parenting relationship. "I'm proud of what we've all built from this," she said quietly. 2 weeks later, a moving truck pulled up to the elegant colonial on Maple Street that had once belonged to the Palmer family. The Johnson family, Michael and Charisse, with their children Damon and Layla, began the process of settling into their new home and community. Unlike the isolated, scrutinized experience of previous families of color moving to Oakwood, their arrival had been preceded by intentional welcomes. A dinner with Catherine and the children had given them insider knowledge of the community. Zoe had already connected Layla to her Student Diversity Coalition. The HOA Welcome Committee, newly revitalized under Diane's leadership, had prepared a comprehensive orientation packet that emphasized community inclusion, along with the practical details of garbage collection and landscaping requirements. As they unloaded boxes, neighbors stopped by with genuine welcomes and practical offers of help. No suspicious glances, no immediate scrutiny of their landscaping or mailbox height, no subtle implications that they should feel grateful to be allowed in such a prestigious community. Across the street, Karen Whitfield's former home had new owners as well, a young interracial couple who had been attracted to Oakwood specifically because of its newly publicized commitment to inclusion and equity. The community's painful public reckoning had paradoxically become a selling point for families seeking neighborhoods where difficult conversations about race and belonging happened openly rather than being suppressed beneath polite veneers. The monthly community conversation that evening, held in the community center with a record attendance, Amara introduced Marcus as the featured speaker. His topic, Beyond Settlement, Building Sustainable Community Change, reflected the evolving focus from addressing a specific incident to creating lasting transformation. 6 months ago, a moment of bias exposed deeper patterns that had long gone unacknowledged in our community, Marcus began. Today, we're not simply implementing settlement requirements, we're reimagining what Oakwood can be. He outlined the concrete changes, enforcement policies that were transparent and equitably applied, leadership that reflected the community's growing diversity, educational initiatives that created space for honest conversation, and social connections that crossed previously rigid boundaries. But perhaps the most significant change, he continued, is the hardest to measure: how we see ourselves and each other. A community is ultimately defined not by its gates or property values, but by how it responds when confronted with its own failings. Oakwood chose the harder path, not denial or superficial appeasement, but genuine reckoning and transformation. In the audience, Tyler listened intently to his father's words, sitting between Catherine and Zoe. The psychological wounds of that Sunday afternoon confrontation 6 months earlier hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had been transformed. From raw trauma to meaningful narrative, from passive victimhood to active purpose. As the presentation concluded and attendees broke into discussion groups, Catherine noticed the Johnson family entering tentatively. She immediately went to welcome them, introducing them to several neighbors who greeted them with authentic warmth. "We've heard so much about these community conversations," Charisse Johnson said. "When we were looking at neighborhoods, these were mentioned as something special about Oakwood." Catherine smiled, recalling how the first session had drawn barely 40 people, many attending in secret for fear of community backlash. "They've become the heart of our community rebuilding," she explained. "A place where difficult conversations happen by choice, rather than necessity." As the evening progressed, Marcus observed the evolving social dynamics with quiet satisfaction. Karen wasn't present. She had moved to a neighboring city where she was working to rebuild her real estate career, while continuing her education in bias awareness. Their facilitated conversation had been difficult, but necessary, creating, if not friendship, then at least a mutual recognition of shared humanity and the possibility of growth. Near the refreshment table, Tyler was eagerly explaining neighborhood customs to Damon Johnson, the two boys quickly finding common ground in their shared interest in basketball. Zoe and Layla sat with the student coalition members, already planning activities for the upcoming school year. Officer Ramirez, now a regular attendee, was engaged in conversation with Michael Johnson about the department's new training protocols. Amara moved between discussion groups, her skillful facilitation fostering connections between residents who might otherwise have remained in separate social circles. As the meeting wound down, Diane approached Marcus with news. The city council had requested a presentation on Oakwood's transformation, interested in applying similar approaches to other neighborhoods experiencing tension. Our painful moment is becoming a template for change elsewhere, she observed. Marcus nodded, watching as Tyler helped stack chairs without being asked, his small face serious with responsibility. That's what justice looks like sometimes, not just addressing a specific wrong, but creating ripples of transformation that extend far beyond the original injury. As families dispersed into the warm evening, the gates of Oakwood Estates stood open, a symbolic representation of a community in transition. The physical barriers remained, the carefully tended landscaping, the exclusive addresses, the material, privilege represented by each elegant home. But the invisible barriers had begun to shift, creating space for authentic belonging beyond superficial inclusion. The community's transformation remained incomplete, as all human growth inevitably is. Biases would still emerge, mistakes would be made, disagreements would arise, but the foundation had been laid for addressing them openly, rather than burying them beneath polite denial. As Marcus drove home with his children, Tyler's voice came from the back seat. "Dad? Are we going to keep coming to Oakwood even though everything is fixed now?" Marcus met his son's eyes in the rearview mirror. "The work is never really finished, buddy. Communities are always growing, always learning, just like people. Like how I'm still going to therapy even though I don't have bad dreams as much anymore." Exactly like that. Some changes happen quickly, and some take time and continuous effort. Tyler considered this with the thoughtful seriousness that had become his hallmark. "I think I'd like to keep coming then, to help make sure it stays fixed." From the seat beside him, Zoe reached over to squeeze her brother's hand, a protective big sister who had watched him weather trauma and emerge stronger, a young advocate who had transformed her anger into action. As they passed through the gates of Oakwood Estates, no longer stopped, no longer questioned, no longer viewed with suspicion, Marcus reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple Sunday afternoon pickup. A moment of injustice had catalyzed months of painful but necessary growth, not just for a neighborhood, but for each person touched by the ripples of that initial confrontation. The transformation wasn't perfect or complete, but it was authentic, rooted in difficult truths rather than comfortable illusions. And in that authenticity lay the promise of a community where gates might still define physical boundaries but would no longer determine who truly belonged. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.